Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast, and with me is one of my favorite Republicans, Jacob Geise of the Minnesota Republican Party. Jacob is an activist in the Minnesota Republican Party. He represents the more civic nationalist and pro-labor populist element of Republican politics these days. So that's why he's my kind of Republican. And welcome to the show, Jacob. How you doing today?
Oh, excellent. Thanks for having me on again. I was excited when you said, hey, let's talk. And I'm always ready to talk. Probably too much.
Yeah, me too. Well, us political aficionados, we always love to talk about politics. There's no question about it. And we can go on and on and on and on and on until the cows come home to roost. Jacob, thank you again for joining us on the show. And a lot is going on in Republican politics. We had the recent Republican convention. We had the recent debate, the first debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And we have a lot going on. The Trump campaign, the tenor has gyrated between at least a surface pro-labor populism and civic nationalism. Since the convention, it seems like it's moved more towards a Reaganomics model to sometimes even some of its, I would argue, some of its excesses, like the infamous conversation that Elon Musk had with Donald Trump on X and whatnot. So there's a lot of gyrations going on in this campaign. But a lot of good news going on in the Midwest regarding the Republican Party. So I wanted to talk about those, some of those topics and really the progress going on in Minnesota with Republican politics and its pro-labor civic nationalist wing. And I also wanted to get your feedback on Governor Tim Walz. Now, we had another guest on the show. He's a really good libertarian, and he's really good on Russia, China, and the foreign policy threats. And he's independent-minded, Tim Starr, and we had talked about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Walz is somebody, for the record, and we'll get into it more, I have mixed opinions on. There are some things with his economic reforms in Minnesota that I really agree with, that really should be implemented nationwide. But I have some very strong concerns about his contradictory record and work he's done with the communist Chinese, at least. So, I wanted to get into that, and especially his record in Minnesota. Really, what is the facts, the myths, the good, the bad, the great, and the ugly. So before we start, I wanted you to tell the audience a little bit about your background, your position within the Minnesota Republican Party for me, please.
Oh, sure. So I'm officially, I'm the second vice chair for media with the St. Louis County GOP. So if you look at Minnesota, you see the big pointy arrowhead pointing east. We're everything, if you can find Duluth, we're kind of everything north of that, and kind of a big box. It's the largest county in the state for sure. It's actually bigger than the state of Connecticut, which makes it kind of unfair for a little, county party to have to traverse. But so I do a lot of social media stuff. We've run social media campaigns. Personal history, as far as I've been involved in politics practically since I could vote. I think I started the first chapter of the Young Republicans in my college, and have been involved on and off with mostly just with county politics, or not county politics, just county level BPOUs. Do you have BPOUs in Florida?
No, when I was involved with some Republican campaigns, they had the RECs, the Republican Executive Committees and whatnot, which was an elected position.
Sure.
But I'm not familiar with that other term.
Okay, BPOU is apparently what we use in Minnesota. It's basic political organizational unit, which, yeah, it's a name, if as much as anything else. But it's basically our county level GOP committee, and mine is an elected position too. I've been doing this since I believe 2018. So I had taken a break before. As far you mentioned my kind of stances, I'm kind of a reformed Reaganite. As far yeah, he smiled. I definitely could just consider me a big Tea Party Republican for most of my teenage and college years. But then I really started to look at things differently after Donald Trump was elected out of almost necessity. I didn't know what the heck was going on. I didn't necessarily hate the guy, but he was represented something very different. And so then I started just thinking about things and listening to some people. And actually, and I really think living up here I don't know if your listeners know, this part of Minnesota is referred to as the Iron Range. And it's actually, I believe, somewhat, to give you an idea, something like, I believe upwards of 60% of all the steel used in World War II was mined here for the US, obviously. So very long history of mining, and every kind of sort of industrial labor issue is pertinent up here, from outsourcing to unions and all that kind of thing. And it's been really ground zero for, everyone talks about the realignment, and that's happened since Trump took over. And really, this is kind of the quintessential Rust Belt area, solidly like unreal, reliable Democratic vote up until maybe it's been shifting, but the first real shockwaves were in 2022 when Republicans took the House Senate seat, and then several of the House seats around it, the Minnesota House seats around it, some of them for the first time in like 80 years, and before that. Our former, when I was growing up, our congressman was, his name's Jim Oberstar, and and he would command like 70-30 kind of votes. It was just that kind of solid Union Democrat area. And now the Iron Range is majority Republican represented, and our congressman is a Republican and has been for, I think this will be his fourth term if he wins, and he more than likely will, especially since we were redistricted to the west, which is much more red. So, so that's a little bit about me. It's been a really fun place. I'll go in. Can I go into some of our local races since I'm already at that age?
Absolutely, go right ahead, please do.
Yeah. So we currently have, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you go into our area, so now you're zooming on Google, you're north of Duluth, you find Hibbing, Virginia, Chisholm area. That's the heart of what we call the Iron Range. That's if you look into Minnesota history, that's what the Iron Range really is. And there's, it's recent history for certain. If you look up kind of these legendary state politicians, and I'll just throw out names because I find the history interesting. The big recent ones were Tommy Rukavina, David Tomasoni, Tom Bach, all of which were massive influences on Minnesota politics. And now in 2024, like I said, we're almost completely represented by Republicans. Only one senator and one this is outside of Duluth. I should mention that Duluth is solid blue still, which is an issue that I think the GOP has to deal with going forward. If we can't win an 80,000, city of 80,000, there's not a lot of long-term hope for a big national majority vote kind of party. But with our local races, as far as being a kind of, like you said, civic national populist. It's been so cool to watch and to have open minds to. We were really ground zero for the Iron Range surprised people by mostly voting for Donald Trump, when before, again, it had been a solid blue vote forever. And so that's really opened up ears around here to things like saying, hey, look at all these union guys. They want what we want, guys. They're not pushing woke stuff on our kids. They're not part of this culture war. They really don't care. They just want to know that, job, retirement, and that their kids are going to a good school, that kind of thing. And they hate things like right to work laws. They just want to be heard. And so I was actually really gratified. Our state senator ran over to me at a parade. I had written an article about kind of my take on what happened in 2022 and why the Iron Range outperformed pretty much the rest of Minnesota. The GOP was decimated in the metro suburbs, where before it had at least been fairly well represented, and just clobbered. We currently have one party rule, but with Tim Walz and is governor and then Senate, House, and all that.
Can I ask a question? When you mentioned you got clobbered and now Minnesota is one-party rule under the current governor, now vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, and Tim Walz. Why, in your opinion, and what is the party's view? And of course, I don't want to make you, put you in an uncomfortable position given your official capacity within the state party. But what is the belief as to why the Republicans got clobbered in 2022 in Minnesota?
Well, it depends on which part of the circular firing squad you're in, kind of
well,
thing.
Let's get both sides. We want to be fair on the program. I mean, and a little bit about my views. I mean, I'm again civic nationalist, populist. I was a Reagan Republican, but there are aspects of Reaganism that I still have. There are, I wrote an essay called "What is Radical Civic Nationalism" on my new Substack page, where I just have a hodgepodge of views. So I have some thin slivers of that Tea Party libertarianism still present. But anyways, going back forward, what are the different, quote, circular firing squad opinions here? Let's go through this together.
I think they probably break down to basically, I think with the grassroots, you have a lot of, well, the party didn't back such and such candidate enough, and then the party would say either, well, this person was unelectable, or they didn't, campaign right. And honestly, there's probably truth to all of it. It doesn't break down so much as policy, which is actually maybe a problem. But we had a candidate in Scott Jensen, and he's a good man. I won't belittle him at all, but he ran what I think was a 2020 campaign in 2022, and people did not want to talk about COVID anymore. Because Walz, theoretically, Tim Walz had a big gaping hole in the riots that happened after the George Floyd incident. But either because Jensen also himself is a medical doctor, and he kind of made a following with sort of being outside the box. Like he had a small podcast when he was a state senator, so he kind of explained a lot of his views then. And kind of unfortunately, because nothing he said as far as policy was much different than standard Republican politics, but there was enough that they could define him early. And of course, we had. I do think it hurt. I do think it just hurt the GOP nationwide, especially in a place like Minnesota with the Roe versus Wade being overturned. whatever you think of that, and I happen to agree with it. I do think it allowed that the Democrats to make it a single issue vote for a lot, especially for their base, which is what they needed. As far as the rest of the party, there's a point. I'll just say I'm not exactly sure why we did so bad everywhere. Theoretically, we should have been okay because it was, second year of an incumbent Democratic president. The midterm, usually the other party does okay, but in Minnesota that just did not materialize, except for, I think, well, I should say the outstate. So there's kind of a half donut around the Twin Cities area, which is all very, very well, the varying degrees of rural. So like you have southern Minnesota around Rochester, western Minnesota, which is like Moorhead, Fargo, and south, and then over east to the Iron Range, which is kind of where all the movement, the kind of deepening red is happening. And I'm sure those regions did very, very, very well, or at least increased their share of the vote for Republicans. Because then with the Iron Range, we ran people who were they ran for their locality, which is, I think, exactly what they needed to do. And they ran against right to work laws. They ran, and that's such a big one. I don't know if people, I remember people being almost, livid that Doug Mastriano lost Pennsylvania in 2022 because he was supposed to be the big MAGA blue collar dude. And I watched a video with him once or watched a couple of things, and it's like he was pro right to work and he talked about cutting Social Security and Medicare. Like in a state like Pennsylvania, that's going to at least make people stay home because that's what it would have done around here. Now we have his name's Cal Warwus, and I'm actually related through marriage to him. He's running for what would be my district, so it's right around Virginia. And he went full on pro-union, anti-right to work, actually blew away some of he actually, some Republicans don't even, now there's bad blood on both sides. The Republicans have earned their distrust by labor, but labor, for its own part, has not always given them good reason to want to come to the table in good faith. Yeah. So if we're going to get back to something good, it'll be a two-sided thing. And it was cool seeing Cal he's a U.S. steel worker. He works for, we call it's Minnesota Taconite, but if I ever mention MinTac, that's what it is. And so he's a U.S. steel worker. And he went to the USW local, and they had the big interview with the regional directors. And the coolest thing was they chose not to endorse this election. They could have easily, it would have been easy to endorse his opponent. She's a typical kind of trying to look moderate Democrat. They wouldn't have, but the fact that he gave them no reason to not endorse him to the point where they couldn't just say, oh, just endorse the Democrat, was huge. And again, up here, up to the idea that the U.S. steel workers, United Steelworkers wouldn't just endorse the Democrat out of course, is huge for us. That was like I told them, it's like, that's like the second best thing you could hope for, either an outright endorsement or they're saying, that's all right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, one question. You mentioned the right to work laws, which course, Florida down here where I'm located, even though there are unions in Florida, Florida is a right to work state.
Yes.
So the unions are substantially weaker down here. Florida is one of the first states that passed right to work back when the Dixiecrats ran the state back in the 1940s. It passed, as a matter of fact. How big is the right to work movement in Minnesota? Now, your neighbor, Wisconsin, which was very well known to be a very union-friendly state, passed right to work under Governor Scott Walker in a majority Republican legislature well over 10 years ago. How big is the movement for right to work within Minnesota and specifically in the Republican Party? And what kind of relations do the pro-union people and the right to work people have within the Republican Party? Is there conversations, or is there just a lot of hostility with the twain shall never meet? What's going on with that?
It's actually, I think, as of right now, I know some more libertarian-minded of our representatives, or our Republican representatives. I shouldn't say I know them, but I've paid attention to their Facebook stuff and things like that. And I watched a conversation with two of them who are very, very much kind of your, I wouldn't say standard, but definitely more libertarian economics, classical, liberal economics kind of guys. So very much more right to work kind of people. And one of them, and they had a conversation about it, and one of them was saying, I don't know if, as how we've talked about right to work, I don't know if I really am into that anymore. So we're seeing movement on that. And the fact of the matter is that it's just kind of, you asked about the movement's power. I don't think there's a lot of power. The last governor candidate we had, Scott Jensen, did actually say he didn't support right to work. So to his credit, I don't think he reached out hard enough to the labor movement after that, but that at least was a fig leaf he was willing to give. And then before that, it was one of those things that kind of came up through with the Tea Party, which was unfortunate, and just was pushed as this sort of, well, of course, we're Tea Partiers. Why wouldn't we want the freedom to work wherever you want? That kind of mentality. But it's hit such a wall. And the fact is, you can't argue with the results we've had up on the Iron Range, where we're like, we said no, we gave them that, and we won. I would say the power is on the anti-movement, especially the anti-right to work movement, especially after Wisconsin. After Wisconsin did it, it was never going to happen here. Minnesota from what I understand, has always been a little more union heavy than Wisconsin, which Wisconsin's fairly unionized. I have relatives in the farmers union and all that kind of thing over in Wisconsin. But
why do you think? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, and it's such. It was, and as far, this is more my personal opinion, it really can't fly this far north, as it were. It was never part of the culture, as it was down in the South, where just the two philosophies kind of grew up at different rates, and the North never really was as open to it as the South was.
Yeah, why do you think, and since you mentioned you have relatives living in Wisconsin and they were part of the farmers unions, from your opinion, your research, and what you've heard from your relatives and perhaps friends in Wisconsin, why do you think in Wisconsin, of all places, the right to work movement really stuck there, since it is a fairly heavily unionized state, both in the private and public sectors?
Yeah, I think what that was the unfortunate animosity we've had between labor and the GOP since basically Nixon. I know the unions will point back to Reagan, and that really, and I do disagree with some of Reagan's stances on or actions on unions, but I feel like it's really the worst of it has been set post Reagan, the animosity between labor and the GOP. And the thing with the Republicans, you still see activists doing this, where the union, when they say the unions, they do not mean the union members. They mean the bosses. And to them, it's just, and looks like, and to be fair, it does look like to a Republican who's trying to who might not understand labor issues and who might not, that might not be their top of their, where they're thinking anyway. They can't understand why you don't see your guys, the jobs are still moving out, but your union is just funding the Democrats. So there, and so I think the thinking behind Wisconsin was after the 2010, because that was really the big Tea Party movement that swept into Wisconsin. I think it wasn't a way from Republican thinking. I really, I think to their credit, I think in their way, it was trying to cripple this Democrat apparatus that to a lot of us, and in Minnesota, it's unreal the sort of organization the Democrats have through these different nonprofits and kind of the labor movement isn't quite as it's an integral part. That's as of right now. But so in Wisconsin, I think, and especially if I remember correctly, another thing Republicans like to do, which they shouldn't, not at this point, is they want to make a difference between the public and private sector unions. Mm-hmm. Because to them, they're like, okay, private sector, I understand that. At least that's out. The government's not, it's between you and your boss. What your boss will show you the actual profits, and you guys go to town, figure it out. Whereas with the labor unions and the public unions, and especially the teachers unions, there's not only especially the teachers unions pushing these really far left sort of lunacy, which isn't cool. They do themselves a disservice. Because I have no problem with teachers personally, but the thinking, huh?
Nor do I. I don't have the problem with strong teachers unions either. I have an issue, particularly with the NEA, with their very extreme left positions.
Yes. And
so, are there Republican, aside from police and fire, which traditionally are more Republican than Democrat, are there like Republican members of the teachers unions, librarians? I'm a member of my public sector union down here in Florida, and I would not call myself by proper definition a quote far leftist. Yeah. Do you find there are a lot of teachers that want to be Republicans that also want a good deal for themselves from their managers and from the public treasury, so they're able to support themselves, but that really like Republican principles? And do you think it's kind of a to do the divide and conquer strategy that's Governor Scott Walker did, of dividing at first public and private sector workers? Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of a disservice, because I think we got to show respect for all good members, all Americans of good faith and good nature of all social classes, whether business or labor or professionals. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree. I don't think, I'm of the opinion right now in this moment of America that we should all just be realizing nothing is working. Like from the party level up to actual governance. Particularly, I know my side. You know, Democrats can comment more on what they don't think works on their side. But no, well, the biggest thing with the divide and conquer strategy that Scott Walker tried to use is your base might understand the distinction he was trying to make with the public-private unions. The labor members do not see that distinction. And I've told people this before because that was something that was sort of filtering into the conversation kind of, I don't remember when, but when I was definitely starting to take more of a pro-labor view. I said, they don't bother making this distinction. They don't make it. If there is anything to that, it's not now to talk about it, just from a pure politics point of view. I think with anything, divide and conquer, well, it's not working. I'll just tell you that right now. Michigan just overturned their right to work law, rightfully. I was rooting for the Democrats for once. Yeah. But usually what you do is you go into these places and you say, well, what are you looking for? How can we help you? Because, and it'll, like with and it won't be right away. And so I'm kind of talking more from an activist strategical standpoint. I think that I don't really have a problem with public sector unions. I think even if there is any credence to the arguments from like the kind of fiscal hawks about bartering with taxpayer money or whatever, it's like, well, really, with all the crappy spending we're doing, we're going to worry about our workers who are being our civil servants and things like that. Let them. We just had a city strike in Virginia, near us, and I have no problem with any workers striking for a better living or a better benefit or whatever they think they need. It's in the freaking Constitution. But with the public unions, I think conservatives who are missing the point, and they still do this with private sector unions too. People who don't pay attention most of the 4 years of a presidential term and then suddenly pay attention again during the presidential election, I've been noticing kind of come out of the woodwork and drudge up these old arguments, like, basically why the union bosses will never go Republican or something like that. And my thing is, well, who cares as long as the members are, well, no, I should say that's the wrong thing. Like with the U.S. steelworkers around here, and you can ask, I've heard this from many different people, the shop people, the guys in the shop doing the work are voting Trump this year. He's their guy, especially the younger ones. It's actually kind of funny, kind of the inverse, old people vote Republican, young people vote Democrat. Around here, one of the most stubborn Democrat demographics is the old miners, which for good reason. I don't blame them. They've seen a lot of reason to vote the way they do. Hopefully we can show them that that their interests are best served over with the Republicans. But so then back with the teachers unions, the Republicans complaining about it. It's like, well, let's get the teachers on our side. Like you were saying, there's tons of them who are they love teaching and they're good at it, and and we need all the good teachers we can, but they do not feel represented by their leadership. As far as, like you said, the extreme political views and stuff like that. And it's like, so get on, see what they want, and see where their hangups to us are. Because we took, with the right to work laws, we took one of the biggest hangups away from them, and we're seeing dividends from it. So what's the hangup from the teachers that, feel like they aren't being seen by us? Or the public, did you say you were a city worker? Or
no, I work for the Broward County Library System. I'm a community library manager, and I've worked for Broward County since 1998. I was in my early 20s, so I've worked for a long time, but I would not describe myself as an uber leftist at all.
No.
And and I really don't feel I have a home here, because the Democratic Party here in Broward County in Florida, they have a very hardcore left-wing progressive contingent. Like, for example, there was a young lady running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is a sitting congresswoman, as you probably know. High up in the Democratic Party hierarchy was the former DNC chairwoman, Jen Perelman, and she is very hardcore leftist. And then Debbie Wasserman Schultz is very much a corporate-friendly Democrat. Are there things that I agree with both candidates, or both Wasserman Schultz and Perelman on? Yes, but not enough to get me to vote for either one of them, even though they're not running in my district. The Republican Party, I think the reason why from what I can tell, the realignment has really not entered here in Florida is simply because what the Republicans are doing and running on has worked. And it's worked since the election of Jeb Bush. So on a practical political level, they're not going to change things. I have been out of the loop of the Republican Party in this state since about 2012, 2013. I volunteered for certain candidates, got to meet people, make observations. And it was kind of, a lot of people were nice, but there were some individuals that I've also had some very bad experiences too. Quite a few, to be fair, some very bad experience. Not that most of them were not rude to me, but a lot of disappointments, or people, including, for example, one fellow, Joe Paterno, who is a commissioner and I think either mayor or vice mayor in Tequesta, which is a very wealthy area near West Palm Beach. He came to a screening of Death by China back when I was involved with the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and he was originally from Pennsylvania. He was an entrepreneur and very wealthy, and he said, look, I'm not going to tell you my name, even though he signed his name later. That's how I found in the signing sheets. And he basically said, look, I'm from Pennsylvania, and the reason why we lost our steel industry, or most of the steel industry from what it was simply because of the unions. And he basically gave the trope that the workers are lazy and on drugs and this and that and everything else. It was very sort of, it really was giving he was basically confirming the negative stereotypes of quote unquote conservatives and Republicans. And there were many other people. There was a lot of disappointments on national security votes, like Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, who voted to give Vladimir Putin's Russia permanent normal trade relations in 2012, which was an Obama initiative. Many Tea Party Republicans in both houses of Congress voted for it, by the way. So there's a lot of these disappointments. You take a look at Adam Hasner, and there's a lot of other stories I can give you, but also positive examples of certain Republicans who kind of understood parts of our message, but they had a very difficult time because they did not have the same resources as a lot of the other Tea Party or so-called established Republicans. And there was really a lot of overlap on important issues, as I found out, between the many Tea Party Republicans and the so-called establishment Republicans, including establishment Republicans reinventing themselves, like Adam Hasner, who was very prominent in the state legislature. Adam Hasner basically was a hardcore Jeb Bush Republican who then rebranded himself a Tea Party Republican, even though there was very little difference between the two policy-wise. So I think Florida is, from my perspective, is very politically dysfunctional on both
Oh, sure.
sides. I'd like to hear a couple of opinions from you and your colleagues. What is the opinion of Republicans up in Minnesota on the state of the Florida Republican Party? Let's start with that question. Then I got some follow-up questions on that too.
Well, on a purely kind of selfish level, we envy the living hell out of you guys, because you've the showing you got the Republicans in Florida had in 2022, which it wasn't even a red wave, it was just red. Like, that was just what it was. And so, on a slightly tongue-in-cheek thing, we envy it, but I'm actually really curious about the Miami-Dade County going red and things like that, where with heavy minority populations, Hispanic, obviously. That's where my real interest in Florida comes, is what that looked like. And obviously you can't translate that. Hispanics are not.
Well, I could speak about that. I could speak about that. Yes, go ahead.
I would be curious, but it's interesting. I don't really, because there's nobody who wouldn't have said that Ron DeSantis, just from the party people I see, who wouldn't have said, oh yeah, he's, I like some of what he's doing, but he really never had a chance as far as primary. So there really isn't a lot of, oh, I wish for this Florida policy or that Florida policy, aside maybe, the odd, oh, they don't have this tax or that tax. But because it was so primed, the base here was so primed to be Trump, for the presidential thing, I don't think there's a lot of, how do I say it, practical interest in the Florida GOP. Maybe on like the higher levels, like, kind of like I said, like how did they turn Miami-Dade County, that sort of thing. I might ask somebody that now. I've not had a good conversation about Florida yet with one of my colleagues.
Yeah, Miami-Dade, has a lot of emigres, traditionally, of course, from Cuba and also from Nicaragua and Venezuela. And that is, of course, up into Broward County and Palm Beach County to the north. And their positions, I know at least one prominent Republican who I'm friendly with still. He was a veteran of the Bay of Pigs, attempted liberation mission against Cuban communism. Good man.
Mm-hmm.
And so these people are it's simply an issue, and this is an important issue for me in this program, is the threat of communism and socialism as properly defined.
Right.
A lot of Hispanic voters from that part of the world are intimately familiar with the tyranny of communism in some form or another, or socialism in its more despotic form. And they've had bitter experiences. A little bit about myself personally. 5-6 months after my divorce, the good Lord has saw fit to me to put Hispanic women in my path. And, obviously when you're dating someone, you get close to them, you get to know their politics, their history, obviously. And there's some very real world terrible experiences with communism.
Sure.
And it's the same also in the workplace, political functions I go to, you meet these people, and it's generally the same thing. And there was this perception that the Democrats are the party of socialism and communism, they're soft on it, or they're outright communists. And that's something that down here the Republicans have really played that message very aggressively. Now, do I think all Democrats are communists, like in Congress and the Senate and the state level? Obviously not. However, I am going to say something controversial, and I have documented it. And groups like the Communist Party USA and the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, they have penetrated the communists, or rather the Democratic Party. They have members by the admissions of both of those organizations in the House, and they do cooperate with both parties in a sort of popular front strategy. And that's something that is explicitly has been admitted to by the Communist Party USA in its books, like A Lame Duck in Turbulent Waters, as well as in their newspapers, the People's Daily World, which used to be the Daily World, and even in the Daily Worker as far back as the late 1930s. So that is a real issue. It's not right-wing hyperbole. So that's made up. And, you know, many, though not all, but a number of Democrats have not been very good on the Cuba embargo, therefore the lifting of the already porous trade embargo in Cuba, and a number of the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I say so-called because there's nothing progressive about this, where they've had very close ties with the Venezuelan communist dictatorship of Hugo Chavez, and then even to a lesser degree, Nicolas Maduro. So that turns off a lot of people. And to be honest with you, that's one of the big issues that really prevents me from becoming a full-throated member and activist of the Democratic Party. So that really upsets a lot of Hispanic voters. And it's not just the ones from Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. A number of other Hispanic countries, or Latin American and Caribbean countries, have been under the gun of socialism and communism. And let's not mistake about it. When I say socialism, I don't mean programs like Medicare and Social Security, or even Medicare for all. I don't mean, you know, restoration of Glass-Steagall or OSHA or the EPA or taxes. I don't view that as socialism. What I mean is basically the severe control of the private economy to the point of micromanagement, or outright ownership in the means of production, and distribution. That to me is socialism, which I'm unalterably opposed to, largely speaking. So that's what gets a lot of Hispanics down here in South Florida in a tizzy, because you also have the country of Colombia was victimized by the FARC, the ELN, the M19. You have Brazil that was under the control of the Workers' Party, which is a quasi-Marxist organization, which now, after Bolsonaro was defeated in Brazil's recent election, now is back under Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party of Brazil. And you have Bolivia, which is under the control of Evo Morales. You have these peoples here in the United States and in South Florida, and they have a lot of unpleasant memories about these governments and political movements. So I think that's the biggest, really, I know it's a long-winded answer, but that's probably the best explanation I can give based on the information available to me and literally personal relationships with Hispanics, both in the workplace, but especially in a personal life and friendships and political collaboration with some, you know, anti-communist Hispanic Republicans to this day informally that I'll maintain relations with. So that's the big thing. Yeah, I think the biggest, what I can tell, and people in the audience, if you want to comment, particularly the Floridians, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest factions, it seems, in the Republican Party are your Libertarian Tea Party Republicans and your more establishment Republicans that are more aligned with the this Florida Chamber of Commerce and the Associated Industries of Florida. And you have that. It's really not clear to me that there's a vocal or influential, truly populist pro-labor wing within the Republican Party. There have been some Republicans in the state house years and years ago that pushed back against Governor Jeb Bush's so-called education reforms, stakes testing. There was some pushback, but they were politically punished or they were term limited out of office. Individuals like Alex Villalobos, Paula Dockery, who was a moderate Republican. She was a rare breed in the state Senate, and she really was at odds with former Governor Rick Scott. There are a few others too, but mostly the Republican-dominated legislature is mostly dominated, as far as I can tell, by the school privatizers, by the very anti-labor people. Governor DeSantis put in special signed legislation that was put forth in both houses, which basically weakened public sector unions even more.
Sure.
Because the rule was public sector unions now have to have, I think, at least 60% of the people recruited in the unions, or it might be 40%. And it's difficult in this state because it is right to work to really recruit people. And there are people that feel that the unions in the public sector are not strong enough. So they're like, well, what's the point of paying union dues? So there's that hurdle.
Right.
You're correct that the Republican Party for a long time had a strategy to destroy the Democratic Party's constituent organizations, to destroy the New Deal coalition. There was an article by Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform in the American Enterprise magazine of the American Enterprise Institute, where explicitly called and laid out that strategy for the destruction of unions through NAFTA and other measures like that, which would destroy, for example, the truckers union, which he said would destroy the Democratic Party's constituency or a large part of it. So it's an explicit strategy, and it kind of rubs me the wrong way, not only because it's not good economics and in the long run not good politics, but kind of this divide and conquer strategy kind of reminds me what the Communist Party USA continues to use, and radical left organizations to hook on legitimate emotions and concerns and cause and sow divisions. Why? Well, it's to advance a goal that if it was really truly laid bare, it would be deeply, deeply unpopular with the American people. It's like what some neo-Nazis tried to do, like David Duke and others, when they tried to infiltrate the Republican Party even to this day. Like Art Jones, for example, you've heard of him, and he ran for Congress in Wisconsin, and he was a National Socialist. He was a member of the National Socialist White People's Party. And, National Socialism is against really all factions of the Republican Party, because we all agree in some form or another about free enterprise and anything that knows, but anybody who knows anything about the National Socialist economic program in action in Germany and elsewhere in occupied Europe, I mean, it was not consonant with any form of Republican economics, or for that matter, even Democratic Party economics, at least. So, so why did he do that? Because he's not going to, Art Jones or David Duke, they're not going to run as open Nazis, because they're not going to get the same voter turnouts and numbers than they would if they are masquerading as a Republican. So, and they'll get like a couple of thousand votes. I mean, there have been times in history where these extremists have gotten, even openly running as Nazis, will get a couple of thousand votes if they're running for this, these racial populists or outright National Socialists. But that's a different discussion for a different time. So, that's my readout on the Florida situation. You do have the police unions, the fire unions. They tend to vote Republican, and Governor DeSantis did exempt the police unions from this, but it applied to all the other unions. And in my opinion, that's bad politics. I would like to see a war against the extreme left in the unions that propound extreme left or Marxist beliefs that have nothing to do with bread and butter issues of the average teacher, firefighter, police. So yeah, in a sense, it's a divide and conquer, but in reality is that when you're using divide and conquer to isolate forces that I consider propounding forms of authoritarianism, to me that's permissible. And I wouldn't do it through any lying or anything. We would be upfront saying, here's what we disagree with you in this agenda. Here's why that your politics has no business in free unionization in the public or private sector, because self-proclaimed Marxists, when they take power, we know in Venezuela and particularly Cuba, they smash free trade unionism and execute union leaders too as well, literally by firing squad. So this is where I would like to see the Republicans really do a better job in winning laborers, because and I'm sorry if I'm going on and you could ask questions and interrupt me. There was one candidate who I worked for. He was a Tea Party guy, but he was kind of heterodox. He was anti-union, but he also butted heads with elements of the Tea Party and the Republican establishment on a number of issues too as well. And he actually threw lobbyists out of his office too as well when they tried to approach his campaign about differing issues and currying favors. And his name was Mike Lemire, good man, really cool, crazy, but in a good way.
Yeah,
I liked him. And good man, and hopefully he'll get back in politics maybe one day. And he had mentioned that when he spoke to teachers, he said the teachers are like, my God, we are so thankful for you, Mike, that you're not blaming teachers for the problems in the classroom. You're like water in a desert, because we're so sick. We are Republican teachers, and we're so sick and tired of Republicans blaming us for all the problems with the students and what goes on in the classroom. So, I would like to see a shift in the Republican Party, but the problem is the power and the money is with these, I hate to use the term, but I've used it many times, plutocratic interests that really have a level, I would argue, of disdain towards, I hate to use the term, the 99%, but I'll use the colloquial expression, the 99%. They just don't like them. There is a class consciousness and class division. And with my experience with, I would say 50% of the wealthy people that I've met, maybe 75% that I personally met, there is a lot of class bias and distrust and arrogance. And that's what I've seen in Republican politics. Also, there's a lot of heavy ideology too. And the local talk radio, whatever is not national, like the late Rush Limbaugh, for example, or Sean Hannity, a lot of the local radio talk show hosts like Brian Mudd. I mean, I haven't followed them in a long time. Brian Mudd, Joyce Kaufman, and others were very pro-corporate. So that's the layout in Florida. And, I know you might have questions, but one question I want to ask you is, how do you even communicate to these diehard anti-union people down in Florida and elsewhere about our politics and our positions? Because I find there's a lot of ideological closed-mindedness and resistance.
Oh, yeah. But we still have a lot of that kind of stuff up here, too. It's baked into, like I said, this sort of I think I said it during the show, if not before, the apparatus of the kind of, you can call it conservative incorporated or just the entertainment complex, which is really what it is, that there, the ideology is, how do I say, well, the problem with ideology is it's too perfect. You know, like, I'm afraid of the government, therefore I don't want anything to do with anything sort of collectivist. And I know the unions all give to Democrats, therefore I'm against unions kind of mentality. And that's been, I mean, I still fight that up here. And I tell a lot of people that's been my crusade lately, where when I see this just knee-jerk defense of the rich, when the Democrat, and generally the Democrat has said something stupid, like, you know, let's tax all the rich people at 99%, something that is legitimately probably never going to happen and wouldn't work. But
well,
then the idea,
I don't think you and I can. I think you and I agree that's not even desirable.
No,
we're not at 90%.
No, but then the reflex on the conservative side to say, well, you know, how, and just to go into this defense mode on behalf of the wealthy, instead of taking it, which is a reflex that we have to give up. And it's easier the more you're into politics. Like, the deeper you in, like you and me who have been following it, we can step back and say, is that even a good question to, you know, do I even need to defend this? This rich person is, you know, yeah, a lot of them are dorks. They're, like you said, anti-union. They're doing crappy stuff with their labor, especially the multinationals. You know, I don't even need to defend them. I can redirect and say, hey, I get what you're saying is you don't want the socialist redistribution thing to take hold in America, talking to the conservative knee-jerk reaction. So why don't we look at something that would pre-distribute wealth, where everybody can, you know, gets a fair wage right away, and we don't even have to worry about it once it gets to the government end of it. You know, they'll tax what they need to tax, but as far as the people, we don't need to worry about as much about taxing the rich, as it were, or what that would lead to in the extreme forms. With the labor, again, and public too, I need to speak up for my buddy Cal, because not only we're family, we're good friends, who's running for, there was, as I said, the city of Virginia, the unions, the AFCME did a strike over the summer. And he, as running as a Republican, very dyed-in-the-wool, or very populist, pro-union, yes, but very otherwise traditional pro-life Republican, went and marched with them. He went to the picket line with the public sector workers, and I believe he had held up signs. And so the just to give you a ray of sunshine, that it made my day. But it'll be the smallest things, because that's what's happening up here. Is what's happening is, so long as we can keep pressure up nationally through, hopefully, if Trump gets elected, a sort of J.D. Vance character. And I'm hopeful that if Trump got elected, people like Orrin Cass would be getting more of a microphone, even if it's not perfect. And, you know, nobody gets everything. But if people like that are getting the microphone, we get more pressure down at the local level to say, hey, this is the way of the world. You know, these guys are coming up. Let's start listening, because it's working. And with the unions, when you're making these little things, like you said, just to go and listen, it's not that you'll get the endorsement from the NEA or whatever the local is. For us, I think it's Education Minnesota, I think is the union name. And it's that the more of the ground workers start seeing, hey, they're actually representing me better, and I'm getting what I want, plus I don't have to deal with the cultural issues, and telling their friends about it, that's going to put more and more pressure on the legitimacy of the kind of extreme, if there is extremists in the leadership, it puts pressure on them to say, hey, you weren't delivering for us. We want to go this way. Why aren't you representing us like you said you are? Which is, like I said, we see this with around here where we do, like I said, the trades have been the earliest to be friendly towards the GOP up here. So like the pipe fitters, the 49ers, which is the IUOE, the local 49ers is what we call them. Mm-hmm. The Teamsters, I believe our congressman was at least once the Laborers International, I think the LIUNA, that's how I think of them. I always think of their little sign with the LIUNA. But what you're doing is building, because there's too much, I think, as of now, and lightning can strike, earthquakes can happen, but there is an embedded in both in the unions right now, it's an embedded, fairly staunch Democrat hierarchy where, and again, I get where that comes from. That's not a judgment. It's actually I get it, from history and how it's all worked out, but they have gone extreme compared to a lot of their members. But yes, because the Republicans have not opened up their arms to them, they feel lost and kind of rudderless. So, you kind of have the tops of both sides, but it's kind of like, to maybe use a sappy reference in Romeo and Juliet, you have the two families bickering under here, where under here you have the next generation meeting and talking and creating pressure for the uppers that claim to represent the people down here, to change how they see each other, which I think is probably one of the reasons that I think Trump has always been he doesn't have the same whatever you piece together out of his policies, he doesn't have the ideological stigma that people attach to a lot of Republicans. It's just nobody thinks that he sat and thought about what Ludwig von Mises says about anything. We don't. We don't. He loves his country. He's basically in tenor kind of a 1970s populist Democrat.
Right. Especially when he ran in 2015 and 2016.
Yes. And I was.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And maybe you were going this way, and I hear you. I want more cowbell personally of that kind of Trump. I think if I could give the campaign one thing, it would be more cowbell on the populism, please. And because I couldn't tell you what they're thinking. I legitimately think I don't know that it shocked them that Biden was forced out of the race, but maybe they weren't expecting Kamala. And because I don't consider her particularly more threatening than any other Democrat, outside of she'd have better connections, and definitely the media wants to play her up as something that she really isn't, but that they feel they can make her something. But though we'll see. But I think a lot of people want to see the Trump, especially since he got JD Vance on anyway, everyone can look up J.D. Vance's, especially since he got elected to the Senate. He's got a very nice, for a Republican, populist record, as compared to a lot of others before him. Not as good as Josh Hawley, but we can't have everything, you know.
Right.
And I do think J.D. Vance was a better pick than Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley is better as far as policy-wise, but he's not. I think Josh Hawley comes off as a little too. I remember Fred Barnes called him patrician, and he really likes Josh Hawley, but definitely has that, probably a look and a sound that would benefit him in a different time, a more regal bearing that probably wouldn't play as well on TV these days.
You know who's actually turned out to be good, and he started out as a Tea Party Club for Growth guy down here in Florida, Marco Rubio, and when he's up for re-election, I will vote for him. At least rhetorically, he has gotten better. He's not, as Sir Rob Amari has even pointed out, he's not there, like on our level, but he's getting there, and he is definitely tailoring his ideology. I know when I worked for the Coalition for Prosperous America, when I did activist volunteer work for them, they said at the time, and this was in about 2012, 2013, maybe 14, that his office was divided on issues like free trade even then. So,
interesting.
Yeah, so it's real good news on that front. So he's a Republican I will vote for.
I was actually, people would tell me, who do you want, who are you going to vote for in the primary? And I said, well, my guy's not in there, so I'll probably vote for Trump. And I meant Marco Rubio, because I think he has had the name recognition and the populist kind of nuances that could have made him formidable. I think he was wise not to run this time around, just because it would have been little Marco all over again.
Yes.
Yeah, whatever you think of that. And of course, it's Trumpy, but I think him waiting, if he's even planning on it, till 2028 was the wiser choice, if he's even thinking of it all. But it'll give him time to, because he is still pretty new as far as pushing for the more, as we said, populist, pro-worker kind of stuff. And maybe he'll run for governor in Florida or something like that. That would be an interesting development.
Yeah, and look, I mean, for the record, there are some things I agree with Governor DeSantis on.
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate his pro-law enforcement positions. I mean, it's not like he hasn't spent state money for public infrastructure, universities, and whatnot. We can debate on the cut.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to point out which people need to hear, because it's like I still get, especially some people on the right don't understand what governing even looks like, and to point out, no, DeSantis is that popular in Florida, and he has done these things to the betterment of his state. Infrastructure, I believe during COVID, he gave teachers a huge bonus.
Yes,
Some
things, it's not enough, and I think he's made a mistake with the unions on that, and also and I'm a librarian, and I think a lot of the citizen groups, so to speak, like the Moms for Liberty, the books that they have really pushed to get out of school libraries, I looked at them at the workplace, and my colleague and I, we were like, why are these books even being questioned? I mean, yeah, they might have a slant. And there are others where obviously there are books that are not necessarily age appropriate in school libraries. And I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole can of worms on both ends. And I generally tend to be allergic to most forms of censorship based on pure ideas.
Yeah.
So I think hitching his wagon on that is a huge mistake and a huge turn off for me.
It's been so fraught, and especially, and I know a few ladies in Moms for Liberty, and their hearts are in good places. And I don't think we've really had that in Minnesota. They've really tried to focus on at least the people I know, on the really pornographic kind of stuff that doesn't need to be in the kids' life, or at least should have its own section, but then I've heard other things about books. I think in Arkansas or something like that, Michelle Obama's biography or something came up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, no.
Right.
Yeah, that's
I share
ridiculous.
their anti-communism, and that's one of the things I appreciate about Marco Rubio, is he's making the right moves in criticisms of free trade, as well as the financialization of the economy that really started in the 1980s. Force, and he combines that with a position where, at least on paper, he really understands that there's a Cold War going on, and where Russia and China are aligned together. And he really kind of puts both of those, the economics and the national security issues, together and ties them together, and I really appreciate that. Another thing I do agree with DeSantis, and look, I created a video, 1 or 2 videos, where I called DeSantis a fake populist. So to say, for the record, that I'm like full stop pro DeSantis is a huge mistake. I am very critical of DeSantis.
Right.
Extremely critical, hotly critical. But there are other things I agree with him on. I am politically homeless. I don't hitch my wagon on either major political party or any political party in this country, frankly. But another thing I agree with DeSantis on is also introducing into the curriculum teaching about the truth about horrors and subversion of communism and fascism and socialism. And I think that's good. Now, of course, where I disagree with DeSantis, and he'll never touch it, is creating an economic climate here in Florida which precludes or really makes superfluous the message of communism, because a lot of people in Florida, average people, are really hurting.
Right.
You have the homeowners insurance rates have skyrocketed. The rents have skyrocketed. Wages have really not kept up with the rate of inflation, or I would argue it's greedflation. It was something deliberate. It's not because of big government spending a lot of money during COVID and then the Inflation Reduction Act. I do not buy into that Republican/conservative/Tea Party trope. So Florida is the worst state in the country for inflation and for a lot of the cost of living issues. It's very bad, and a lot of that has to land in part on DeSantis's lap. So things like that create a fertile ground where people see that companies, and particularly executives, are profiting massively, and they're getting their 5th yacht, and they're getting their 20th mansion. I hate to speak in hyperbole, but when people see that, they see the reporting, they see that with their own eyes, they're going to be susceptible to a very radical extremist message. And that happens. And that's one of the things where I think it's great that we teach about the horrors of communism and socialism, but I think we also have to make it real, where we have to show that capitalism, or the form of capitalism that you and I support, is truly the best system. We have to create something better, because the part of the problem with a lot of your conservative incorporated types, which really govern Florida, is they are in denial about this. Or they will say, if you don't like your job, move out of the state of Florida, move to another job. It's always this constant deflection for and cover up for corporate power. And they always have these talking points. it always goes back onto the power, the onus goes back on the powerless individual.
Yes.
I had a friend of mine who was an ex-communist. His name was Kenny Stallman, and he killed himself, sadly.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Oh,
and he was
so
defected from a splinter group of the Communist Party USA known as the Party of Communists USA. And what he told me, and I published it with his permission in one of my books and upcoming papers, and he said basically that as far as the propaganda made by Republicans in Florida, the party chairman Angelo is based in New York, said the propaganda writes itself. That was Angelo's party secretary's quote. He said, don't bother working on propaganda, just show potential recruits what your laissez-faire type Republicans or pro-corporate and conservative incorporated type Republicans say about working people and the insensitivity and the lack of empathy and the greed. And he recruited a couple of people before he defected and left the party, the PCUSA. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on the Republican Party on the anti-communist side. And this is where I have a lot of disagreements with people who I consider friendly forces, who I like personally, like Trevor Loudon, like J.R. Nyquist, and others who are good friends of the show. But this is where I think the Republican Party needs a new shift. I don't believe a rising tide lifts all boats as a justification for trickle-down economics. That's a fraud wrapped up as an economic theory. And I think the other thing is I think we have to really also tell the truth about the economics profession. I took Econ 101 and 102 at Florida Atlantic University, and I remember half of it was some of the most counterintuitive BS I've ever heard. It doesn't comport to the historical reality.
Did you see Michael Lynn's? He did a thing, I believe it was for Compact, The Idiocy of Economics 101.
Possibly.
It was a fabulous piece, just excellent, talking about the same thing, just how counterintuitive this whole thing that was basically made for yeoman farmers back in the 1700s, back when some of that may have held true, the whole equal exchange and the trickle down kind of thing, what might have worked back then, but then he just completely slashes it with like, well, but here's what's actually going on in the real world and why none of that works. So if your listeners can find it, I don't know if it was Compact, just Michael Lind, The Idiocy of Econ 101. But yeah, it speaks to exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, so I think there needs, with the Republican Party, I mean, look, there are things I like still about libertarianism and aspects of it. I think on historical points that they've made about a variety of topics, they're correct on. And, I'm not going to go through it now for the sake of the show. But I have really turned against a lot of the libertarian free market fundamentalist or Reaganomics thought, or supply side economics, trickle down economics, has so many names for the same policies.
Yeah.
But, I saw the results. The results were in. And free trade really was the gateway drug that allowed me to really take a harder look on the validity of Reaganomics. And also just the fact that by nature I am generally an empathetic, giving person. I like to put myself in other people's shoes. But on the other hand, I could never join the socialist, certainly not a neo-fascist movement. Right. I mean, Doris LGBTQ+, is in same-sex relationship. I embrace her. Full disclosure, I'll probably upset a lot of conservatives.
You're breaking up a little bit, just FYI. So.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So but I could never, even though I'm a critic of Reaganomics, I could never align myself with communists or socialists, because I don't believe getting rich is innately a bad thing. I have nothing innately against billionaires and millionaires. and whatnot. And I think the acquisition of private property, entrepreneurship, and the wanting to better yourself, that's human nature. And I think that is a hallmark of human freedom. And I don't think that's merely a libertarian talking point. That is confirmed by history. As for neo-fascism, in addition to the economics and politics that I disagree with, personally, as I said, my daughter is LGBTQ+. She has come out a few years ago. I embrace her as a loving father. She is in a same-sex relationship. I approve that. That obviously is against most neo-fascist creeds. I'm also Jewish. And then also I'm in an interracial relationship too with a woman who's Hispanic. So it's like I can't fit in that crowd either.
Right.
So, but the conservative movement, I have real intellectual problems with the contradictory formula of the three-legged stool, which is Reaganism, what was known as fusionism. And, I just feel that's intellectually inconsistent for a variety of different reasons. So moving forward from that, but, at the same time, I have no problem with Christians. I think Christians should be vocal. I think you could have a pluralism of lifestyles. Obviously, there are lifestyles that exclude, like pedophiles, which should be severely punished, and groups like NAMBLA, for example, should be made illegal. For example, so obviously my views of pluralism of lifestyles have their limits and things of that nature. But DeSantis, I think bravo for him putting the anti-communist curriculum. Yes. There are a number of Democrats that did not support that in the State House. Some that did, to their credit, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys in the audience. So again, DeSantis, I really, on an economic issues, I have major problems. I don't think any of the Republican governors, including Jeb Bush moving forward, were really good stewards of the economy, because if you go to this state, the wealth and income inequality is very wide. It's very wide. And I'm not saying I am for equality of results or outcomes. Right. I support that. I think a large level of inequality is natural, but an exaggerated class cleavages is very dangerous in the long run for the credibility of the system. And I think that's where DeSantis has performed very poorly, is the economics.
Yes. Well, to your point, there's a great, I think you can find the actual audio on YouTube of Teddy Roosevelt, who's behind you, saying those exact same points. I believe it was from his 1912 run, where he said, basically, if, on our points, meaning the Progressive Party of the time, which for your listeners is nothing like the progressive movement these days, right? Yes, there's intellectual strands and eventually, and there were some carryover, but the big takeaway from that speech was his saying, if we don't do something to find a middle way, the people who are hurting, because there are really people hurting right now, are going to be more susceptible to the radicals. And he cited revolutionary France, and and saying that if basically the royalty, the aristocracy had listened to the moderates of the time, which I believe I'm trying to remember who he named. But anyway, if they had listened to the moderates of the time, they wouldn't have gone to the guillotine, basically. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, not wanting to use too much hyperbole, but it absolutely does. I see it all the time on Instagram, and I try to post it on my official Republican page. Especially my age, I'm 36, and younger, people who, you wouldn't say they're starving, but they're not thriving in life. They're not anywhere near home ownership. They're rethinking having children and settling down because they don't see any economic future. They don't see a job market that's going to be either fulfilling either personally or fulfilling personally or economically. So, and they don't feel like whereas they look up and see, this is, you were talking about the corporates and the rich people talking down to the lower classes, and that's true. The problem that we have, and I don't actually even think this is just the Republican Party, but a lot of it is just because of age demographics and stuff, is we have a lot of people, let's say older Gen X and above in age, who like to talk down to the newer generations who are suffering very much under this economy. The housing prices are insane. I sit in a house right now because my wife and I lucked out and bought a fixer-upper. Like insane luck. I would never consider my life like on par with someone actually looking for a house these days, because we just lucked out so bad. But to know how we even just we try to my wife homeschools our kids, so she stays home and works way harder than I do, and so trying to live that life that used to be so attainable for Americans, where you had, now I personally believe if a family decides the lady either wants to be the sole breadwinner or wants to have dual income, completely fine, that's up to them. But as someone who does like, who has a positive view of the kind of being able to have a single income so someone can stay home and raise the kids, that's near impossible now.
It is, and it has been for a long time, since Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan, and then I think definitely accelerated under Clinton and the Republican House in the 90s.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's when they passed NAFTA and joined the World Trade Organization, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And there was a massive deindustrialization in the 1980s. I remember some of that because I was born in 1974. Yeah. I mean, there was deindustrialization that was noticeable even in the 1950s, and a good Republican from Nevada, Senator George Malone, documented in Mainline. That's when the United States started to absorb imports from Western Europe and Asia and Caribbean. But it really started to become apparent in the 1970s, and that's when there started to be noticeable pushback in the Congress and from the labor unions. And the labor unions were initially pro-free trade because we had a commanding control of the home market and even international markets. But that started to turn around by the early 1970s. And but really the deindustrialization became noticeable under Carter, Reagan, and then all the presidents afterwards. We already had liberalized trade relations with Mexico under the Maquiladora program. I think it was called the Border Investment Program, which President Lyndon Baines Johnson started in 1966, and that started the outsourcing to Mexico. Actually, a little bit of history there. But Carter and Reagan actually started programs through the Department of Commerce to actually subsidize the outsourcing of American production and jobs to Mexico and elsewhere for varying different reasons. So yeah, I fully agree with the incentivization of the single breadwinner of an economy that creates a situation where, once again, you have the single breadwinner in the family. If a woman wants to work, God bless them, I have no problem with that. No. But I would like to see an economy that incentivizes what used to exist in this country that was taken away by deliberate policy choice. Yes. It had nothing to do with the forces of nature. These are deliberate pieces of legislation and trade treaties and a specific ideology and interest group politics all behind this. They knew what they were doing, and and they knew about the impacts. I mean, there was quite a bit of a hue and a cry about the impacts of what the offshoring of production and jobs would create, the financialization of the economy. There were all kinds of warnings about
Right.
that. Now, I wanted to shift gears, our last topic.
Yeah.
What is your take on Governor Tim Walz? Now, he casts himself in the public eye as a pro-labor populist. I have very mixed views on him, as I elaborated earlier in the show. Both applause for a number of his pro-labor policies, as well as a lot of concerns from a national security point of view.
Yeah.
What has he actually done? What is his real record on issues like education, crime, economics, and also his actual opinions on China?
That one, his actual opinions on China, I could not elaborate on. A lot of it, you only get to see so much during a campaign, and you're half focused on your own candidate trying to get their stuff out. Walz is good. He is from a political standpoint, it's actually interesting. So we have caucuses in Minnesota. So at first the parties endorse via caucus, and then we have a primary. Mm-hmm. Tim Walz actually lost his caucus, lost the party endorsement, but then decided to run anyway in the primary, which they can do. It's generally frowned upon, especially on the Republican side. They're kind of touchy about that. But it was interesting because he was the one, and that I've actually briefly met him. It was actually interesting. I was at a parade in my hometown, and he had come because must have been 2018. So he was running to become governor after he had been a congressman. Mm-hmm. And he actually came and shook our hands. Mm-hmm. And my friend who was with me looked at me afterwards and said he was nice. And my answer to that was, well, they're all nice, that you don't actually get to be a politician by being a jerk, or at least not to the people you're shaking hands with. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he was the one who actually, scared is the wrong word, but who I was actually more worried about, because given the political climate, even in Minnesota, an outright, loud, screechy leftist wouldn't do that well. They might win, but they'll be given a run for their money. He was from a moderate district. That's Brad Finstad is the Republicans. It had been a Republican district. Walz took it for 6 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. And then now it's Republican again. So it's a fairly moderate district, red-leaning moderate district. Mm-hmm. And he was able to look relatable and had a lot of stuff to his street cred, including at the time endorsements by the NRA, mm-hmm. To make him politically very viable, especially in Minnesota, where I read a couple interesting pieces on, I couldn't read all of Sorob's, but talking about kind of the history. And that's one thing I talk to conservatives about too, or at least I like to, is you have to understand the politics of somewhere without pulling your hair out. You have to understand where they're coming from. There's a reason that Massachusetts is so blue right now. There's a reason that Minnesota is blue right now. And there's a historical reason. It doesn't just come out of, suddenly everybody just loves woke Democrats and that's just how it is. You're never going to get past that. Mm-hmm. Minnesota is a very populist state. It's a very left-leaning, but left labor-leaning, not left woke-leaning. Even we didn't rush after our last governor, Mark Dayton, actually signed abortion restrictions. Mm-hmm. Who was a Democrat. Maybe I didn't mention that. So it's been actually a fairly even kilter, as much as Republicans will complain about taxes or whatever. It's been a fairly even kilter state for being so blue. You'd think it would be more like a California or more of a Illinois maybe. Mm-hmm. But but and I think conservatives have to give him this. He is actually an incredibly good executive. He is, during the first few months of COVID, as much as I grew to disagree with what he was doing, and especially after the riots, he kind of lost credibility on that. Like and even you saw, things lighten up a bit more, and so I think they understood what had happened too. But you couldn't really ask for a better administrator of getting out, having a team, getting things done, keeping everybody calm, making everybody feel like they were listened to, even though he, all of his, most of his, executive people are probably further left than him. I'm sure, like his lieutenant governor, Flanagan, she's much farther left, just I think on principle than he is, especially culturally. It's been one of those mixed bags, because I would be very open to, and I think, if he's done good things for labor, I'm glad of it, but he's been so out loud on the cultural issues, perhaps because he thought there was some sort of national stage for him. So he felt like kind of like Ron DeSantis, where they went so heavy on the culture issues because they felt that was their niche. That it's, to me, as someone who actually, I would like to not feel threatened, that's the wrong word, but I would like to not feel like my values are looked down upon or spit on or poo-pooed by whoever's in power. Even if they disagree. And I can't help but get that from the Democrats who are in charge of Minnesota right now.
Yes.
And I don't want to feel that way. As a United States citizen, as a citizen of my state, there's a certain level of me that just wants to, how do I say this? Just to step back and not feel like something's going to go to hell in the handbasket if I take my hand off, the activist wheel. If I don't, and I don't feel like and they don't feel, because of the base and how Minnesota's structured, and because, like I think we spoke of earlier, the Republican Party of Minnesota is doing better now, but in the last 10 years has been in a hole for a long time, for that 10 years. They've really, I think they're kind of drunk on power right now. And whether or not that bears out long term, I don't know. But so with regards to what you're asking about his populist positions, I think as somewhat to, I'm glad for whatever he's done, but I don't think the average Minnesotan can see past the culture issues. Or if they do, the average Republican voter,
right,
or like me, who actually, I'm ready and willing to like somebody who does good things. I'll give credit to people. Well, I'll give credit to him.
Has he made the lives of the average Minnesotan better on a material level? Are businesses thriving? Are the laborers getting higher incomes? I've heard things, for example, the reports on education were, and partially because it was the COVID pandemic, that there was steep decline in scores. But yet I also know he's done some good things, significant things for labor too. So I want to see, what is the reality on the ground? Because you're not a typical, with all due respect to your colleagues, you're not a typical hack Republican. You are more objective. So I respect your position. So has he made life better for the Minnesotans? Who is this Tim Walz?
I would say that up in my area, nobody would say they're feeling better. Unless, I mean, I'm not going to say if you ask a Democrat, oh, how do you like Tim Walz? Most people actually, he probably has a approval rating overall of the economy over 50%. I wouldn't be surprised. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a little lower because he is approaching his 8th year, the end of his 2nd term. And usually people don't get out of that super popular. You got to be unpopular. Then in 10 years, people remember how great you were. Because I don't remember if I told you what I did for a living last time. I had been working at Hobby Lobby. I switched and I'm working as an ad rep for one of the local papers up here. So salesman, basically, ad sales. And you really get the feeling going to local small businesses that nobody's super confident right now. And I can't lay all that objectively at Tim Walz's feet, especially with the national economy just, being so goods and bads. It's kind of like we got some good things. And I know even President Biden has done some okay things in terms of labor and keeping a lot of like some of the tariffs up from the Trump administration, and then trying to at least start some sort of reshoring of manufacturing. But Tim Walz's real power lies in his personality. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of like Joe Biden. They play, and I don't mean play as in lie. I do think Tim Walz is a nice guy who who knows what he's doing. I guess I don't feel Minnesota's in any better state than the rest of the country because of him. Mm-hmm. My family, we see grocery prices skyrocketing. We see, our taxes going up, property taxes, all that kind of thing. And yes, they've done some cool stuff. Like I actually really agreed with them. They did a universal free school lunch program for kids in school. It's like, great. As you said, they did a few things for organized labor. And, I'm hoping that just becomes the norm, that because Republicans are starting to get more labor endorsements, that when the next Republican administration happens at some point, that'll just be a matter of course. But that's a really kind of meandering way to say, I don't see people feeling that much better, but they kind of like him.
Well, he is a likable character. I mean, compared to our governor, Ron DeSantis, Tim Walz is a far more engaging, looser, friendlier personality he seems like the type of person you can sit down and have a beer with, and shoot the breeze with. I wanted to get back before we close up on a couple of features of Florida politics and the demographics. One of the biggest factors which made Florida even more Republican was COVID. And you had a lot of the lockdowns in other states that California, New York, New Jersey, etc., pushed a lot of people that chafed under those restrictions for personal as well as economic and political reasons, pushed them to Florida, where in a number of cases they had positions where they could work remotely, or they were retirees collecting, ironically, pensions, defined benefit pensions included, I'm sure, and they were able to settle in Florida rather comfortably. And many were of a Republican persuasion. These are people from California, New Jersey, New York, parts of New England, parts of the Midwest, etc.
Hmm.
And that caused a huge strain on the housing market.
Sure.
So you had that, but you had that contingent were very Republican,
Yeah.
very oriented towards what I term the post 2016 version of Trump.
Right.
So they were not populist per se, like you or I, or as populist and pro-labor as you and I. These were people that were looking after their own economic interests, just like you and I would, but they were doing it, and not necessarily to the advantage of the other classes in American society in Florida. Um, and you also have the phenomenon in general for decades of retirees of all social classes, but including middle income and upper income people, have been moving to Florida because of the weather and the scenery and the what was at least back then the laid back lifestyle in Florida. Yeah. These are people I know them personally who moved down to Florida. They were retired teachers, military, police. They collected very good pensions from, let's say, from the Defense Department or New York State or whatever, and they can live well. The dollar really went for a long time very far in Florida.
Yeah.
So, and you're right, there is a lot of generational stress and clashes. You have a lot of baby boomers, not all, which is kind of ironic because a lot of baby boomers, and you look at the historical literature, chafed under Reagan and Reaganomics. Yeah. They did. There was a lot of polls that were very critical of Reaganomics, even though he got reelected, in part because I would argue the Democrats really didn't offer anything good. The historian Judith Stein pointed that out in her book, Pivotal Decade. And what had happened is that, but yeah, I see it on social media all the time. You'll have largely Republican Floridians, many of whom were baby boomers, but other younger people, Gen X and millennials, that'll basically tell even the younger generations, who maybe not are doing as economically well as they are, they'll tell them just move out of the state. Interstate 95, accessible, and just drive north. And I gotta tell you, I hate that. I hate when people comment because I think, number one, that erodes a sense of, on a higher level, American nationalism. I think it's those attitudes that divide us in the face of crisis situations that we're faced by China, by Russia. I think it really is debilitating for national unity, and that concerns me from a national security point of view. It's also personally very distasteful for me. It just clashes with my sense of values.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with those values. I think if we had those attitudes, just drive north on I-95 and go to California, California or whatever, well, that attitude gets us nowhere as a nation, because then we would still have slavery, Jim Crow, extreme poverty, and a whole host of other injustices that really shouldn't exist. So those attitudes really keep us backward as a country.
Oh yeah. Well, and what about I-95 to Georgia, but what's to stop you taking a plane to France or wherever is the economic hotness right now, to your point about nationalism? To kind of, it's to, and not only that, where you're teaching your children and younger generations that all they should care about is the dollar, besides the fact you're not even listening to their concerns, which is even worse. You're eroding the sense of placeness.
Yes.
Like for the younger generations, one thing they lack, and I think is why you see a lot of these like online communities, and I don't even mean like weird ones, just so many of them, is because we've eroded a lot through that kind of go to the money, this sense of community right where you're at, and this kind of investedness in we're here, to make the little bit around us a little bit better. Never mind the country. We've got, I know Republicans are, that everyone screamed at Hillary Clinton, and I kind of get it about the whole, it takes a village book, and I've never read it. I'm sure it's filled with crap, but but there is a sense of the village in creating just your basic sense of, like I said, placeness. Like, one thing about the Iron Range where I live, which I've never really felt anywhere else, is this sense of community and identity so localized. Like, I'm Minnesotan, I'm American, they're even more, they're like, well, I'm Iron Range. Not only that, I'm East Range, I'm, West Range. This kind of thing that I really feel like younger generations don't get a lot of, because those communities, are often beset, as the range has, mining, but it's very precarious at the best of times. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of places that's just dried up, or there's not enough. And then this idea that, well, to fix it, if you're not making money, move where there is. That's, the world isn't about profit at the end. Profit's nice. That's like, I try to tell this, and that's one thing you and your listeners, if you're so inclined, can bring up to conservatives who might be concerned about more, government spending or regulations on free trade, that kind of thing. Well, they're completely in line with the founding, if you just read like Alexander Hamilton. But B, if they want this, because a lot of conservatives, they're in it not necessarily because they care so much about the economics, but because they care about what they see as an erosion of the culture around them. It's like, if you want that culture, and we do, and most people do actually, that's broader than just the party. You can't have that for-profit mentality. You have to, have that community mentality. And that's not to bash, I think there's something great about being able to strike out and make it. But as we said, when it just becomes the slogan to avoid problems and to avoid that people legitimately have, they end up having to move because there's nothing left behind them, or they're left with nothingness and an empty community that just feels like a tomb.
And a big issue is with the teachers down here in Palm Beach County, and you have teachers, thousands of teachers leaving the state because they can't afford to teach down here. Mm-hmm. The raises, even negotiated by their unions, are very paltry. Right. And there's really no good answer. In fact, the Palm Beach County, they have plans in effect to import foreign teachers from countries like the Philippines. And this is one of the reasons why Florida, and I have nothing against foreigners, for God's sakes, I date a first-generation immigrant. But the problem is it's getting around the real issue, which is a real bread and butter wages issue. Yeah. And I think another issue with Florida is it's also a very transient state too as well. So to create this sense of place outside the rural areas of Florida is difficult too as well. Now, some communities are better than others, like Coral Springs in some ways has more of a sense of place, which I've grown to like Coral Springs very much, which is where I live. Parts of the ethnic enclaves all over the place that are Caribbean and Hispanic people, there's a very good sense of place and community too as well. The Cubans are notable for that. So are the Venezuelans, the Haitians, Dominicans, etc. So, and that gives you a great feeling because the sense of place is a very important component of actual conservatism. You know, and I think, I don't like saying it in these terms, but there almost has to be an actual civil war in conservatism. And they're not shooting or violence, obviously, but intellectual. And there's going to have to be literally a divorce within the conservative movement, where the people like the Grover Norquists and the Kochs and Jeffrey Yass, who unfortunately is a big supporter of Trump and has compromised Trump in not good ways, you know, folks like that, they need to form their own party. And then the Oren Casses and the Sarab Amaris and others can form their own party and their own competing things. That's what I would like to see what happens. Now, if I were constructing a movement from scratch, I would have open communications with the libertarians and the free market incorporated and conservative incorporated people. I would still absorb some of their ideas. Oh, yeah. But to create a permanent coalition with such individuals, I don't think is a good idea in the long run for the conservative movement. We can talk and learn, but to be a permanent part of a coalition, I think those days have to go. And I think, and this is where people like Brianna Wu is very good on this, on the Democratic side and the left side, the progressives, they need to renounce the people that hate Israel, that hate the United States, that embrace Venezuela and Cuba. You know, I listened to Miss Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report, which is a left progressive show, and one of the things she was not thrilled about with Kamala and Biden, at least, is their lip service and actual policies, in the case of Biden, of China hawkery, meaning a more of a harder line on China. And this is where the left really loses me. They got to really kind of just wave the flag and say, bye, folks. Yeah. It's time to reclaim the Democratic Party in a patriotic New Deal coalition that doesn't crap all over capitalism, full stop, and doesn't crap over defending America's national interests. So where do you find my politics on the political compass or the political parties? Now that we've had conversations offline, online, you monitor my Twitter, maybe you've read my books or my essays. Am I difficult to pin down? I always like to ask politically engaged people that question.
Sure. You would have been if I had been coming at this like in my Tea Party years. I would have been like, what the heck are you on, man? But I think maybe you told me this. I think the radical centrist is kind of a good place to put you, and I kind of consider myself that way too. I'm definitely more culturally. Well, I don't even know how to say that. My beliefs are culturally, I'd be, as the spectrums exist. On social issues, I'd be probably center right. Whereas economically, and I actually took one of those stupid Venn diagram tests, so I can vouch for this. I actually am center left on economically. So someone joked about how much conservatives and more maybe center right to centrist people like to play around with the different definitions: conservative, libertarian, paleo, yada yada yada. I like to call myself a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, because he really, and not perfectly, of course, because no one's perfect, but really kind of encapsulates how I look at politics from the sort of the sort of, I believe in kind of the as we talked about, the more traditional American life. Therefore, my economics must produce this, and whatever we used to consider center right, i.e. the libertarian, Reaganomic, whatever you want to call it, has not produced that. In fact, I would argue that it produced the opposite. So
Yeah.
I would call you like I said, a radical centrist in a good, and I don't know what label, not label. I didn't mean that because labels are negative, but what do you like to say? Like,
Yeah,
what's your
I
pithy?
call myself a radical civic nationalist. Only I use the term radical because it is a departure from the sort of neoliberal total market fundamentalist um, ideology or way of crafting economic policy. You know, so it's radical. I tend to be more critical of a certain type of capitalism without being full stop anti-capitalist. Economics, I would say it's a hybrid of different approaches, but still fundamentally oriented towards private property and free
Right.
enterprise.
Yep.
For checks and balances in the economic sector, I distrust too much centralized government power and too much centralized power in the employers. And frankly, I don't support a society that's totally dominated by organized labor, to be frank. I like as much balance as possible. Um, when it comes to social issues, either dead center, center left, or center right. Economics, dead center. Um, Foreign policy, it's a mixture of a very strong national defense, but I tend to be cautious about too much interventionism. Um,
I would agree with that.
Yeah, one of the things, frankly, I disagree with the realignment folks like Sohrab Ahmari is their stance on Ukraine and whatnot. I do agree, and I document this very, very well, that Russia is an existential threat to the United States. I mean, granted, the Ukrainians are performing a miracle on the battlefield, but people can go and read my Substack articles or the books that I publish. This is where I strongly agree with people like J.R. Nyquist and Trevor Loudon and Tim Starr, and others where we don't agree on the economics and the politics. I mean, we kind of agree on economics, politics, some of the general goals and orientations, but when it comes to the devil in the details, there's a lot of disagreement. But where I agree with them on is the notion that the Cold War never really ended in 1991.
Sure.
And that Russia engaged in a strategic hibernation and was never ever friendly to the United States. Now, I'm not for a weak Russia that's just looted by foreign multinationals, which is the nightmares of your Russian extreme nationalists and communists. But I'm for a strong Russia, but one that is truly decommunized, that really is cleansed of Bolshevik-style culture, and that's not a threat to its neighbors of the United States. Right. So that's what I'm for. I really outline it on my Substack. I'll send you the link when we're done with the show, and I'll DM you on Twitter so you can follow me. I really just kind of take a very careful approach to politics. I'm a civic nationalist because I'm obviously not a racial nationalist. I don't support that for a number of reasons, and perhaps I was a little too revealing about my personal life, but people have to know truthfully so they know where I'm coming from and why, how I believe. And I'm not ashamed of people in my life, including my family. So, I call myself a radical civic nationalist. I'm a registered Republican, but I zigzag back and forth with who I vote for. It depends on the platform and their voting record. And, I'm just politically homeless. That's the bottom line. There's really no home for me down here in Florida, especially politically. I think both political parties, they have good people, don't get me wrong, but it's a train wreck. I mean, in Florida, as I said, you have Democrats that are split between the establishment wing that is very Clintonian, very much in the Clinton-Obama mold, And then you have the out and out radical left, so-called progressives, that we just have totally different views on national security.
Yeah.
And they will also play footsie with socialists, actual socialists.
Yeah.
And while I agree with the critiques of current form of capitalism that socialists will make, I don't agree with their solutions at all. I think it's just as ideologically charged as your hardcore free market types.
Oh, yeah.
And the Republicans, it's, economically, they do not look out for my interests. And I've had some good experiences with the Republicans, but also a lot of bad experiences.
Oh, yeah.
They really left a very bitter taste in my mouth. And they really have not, outside of certain obvious things like supporting law enforcement, which is extremely important, which Democrats, normie Democrats, support law enforcement down too. The Republicans have really not done anything particularly great for people in my profession either. So, I would like to see more of like an old school Democratic and Republican Party that will declare a ceasefire in the culture wars, that will be much more friendlier to organized and unorganized labor and achieve a balance between capital and labor without disproportionately negatively affecting either. And, incorporate the good things that the Democrats and the Republicans have done in this state, essentially.
Yeah.
So, that's where I'm at.
I think it was kind of funny speaking. My dad, so I don't know how famous he'd be outside the state, but there's a very famous governor especially up in my area, but all over the state. His name was Rudy Perpich. And he was a Democrat from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad used to, when he was younger, he was involved in politics a little bit. And he'd go door knocking for different He lived in Anoka, which is basically Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent me a picture one day just a few years ago. And it was Rudy Perpich, him and Rudy Perpich. And he said, "This is me and Rudy Perpich before the Democrats went insane." That were his words. And I thought about how funny it was that I had kind of grown up. Both of my family sides are working class. My mom was a farm. My mom's parents were dairy farmers from Wisconsin, and my dad was Polish Catholic plumbers. That was my family, and so very blue collar, very Democrat, of that era, the very populist, pro labor, Northern Democrat, and I just thought it was funny because I was like, I probably would have thought he was insane when I was just young and dumb. Thinking how cool the Tea Party is, and not that there wasn't good things about parts of the Tea Party, but
absolutely, there are good things about the Tea Party, sure.
But then to realize that, oh my gosh, so I hit my 30s and I'm right back where my dad was when he was young. I just thought that was an interesting kind of transformation, and it's not just that I came back knowing where he had been, but just that we kind of ended up eventually on a very similar page. And he would say he's changed some of his views from back then. But I think the basic sort of working class tenor of our politics jives. And I don't know, I thought that was cool.
Well, I used to be kind of a worshiper of the rich back when I was more of a Reaganomics person. And even when I was in the John Birch Society, and, I tend to be very sensitive towards criticisms of capitalism. I always thought it's a slippery slope to socialism and everything. And I used to believe that. And there are still certain tendencies I have of that thought process, and maybe you have the same too.
I do.
But generally speaking, I tend to distrust militant anti-capitalists and anti-capitalists that pretend that they're reformists in order to infiltrate, more mainstream political formations. And I still have a distrust, and I write openly about that. But, for a number of reasons, both intellectual and personal, I've abandoned that sort of Tea Party, Reagan, free market ideology. Not that I consider myself socialist. Now, I have a question. In your Tea Party days, would you have considered my ideas socialist? Would you have considered myself more mixed economy, or you would have been confused, or?
Yeah, I mean, pretty standard kind of government non-intervention, that's any kind of like programs and stuff was probably a slippery slope. I don't know if I would have ever outright called it socialist. Definitely probably would have said liberal, whatever that means now. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably how I would have classified it back then, and then like I said, then eventually coming to be more very sympathetic, if not outright believing that it's necessary.
Yeah, and I would characterize yourself as an independent Republican. I think you're an authentic conservative. I don't consider yourself far right per se, as is commonly thrown around the term. I think you're, basically you're the type of Republican that I would like to see proliferate in all states, essentially. I don't want to see any. It's not to say I don't want the free market libertarians to be just totally marginalized or anything. I think they have very important things to say. But I think there needs to be a new consensus. And look, I agree with Sohrab Ahmari in Compact Magazine more than I disagree with them. Yeah. I think he brings a lot to the table. And I'm actually trying to work with him to get an interview, but he is busy, so I got some progress on that. People like Orrin Cass, people like Julius Krein of American Affairs, who's not necessarily conservative in the case of Krein, or Michael Lind. These are very good developments in the right. I think the people in organizations like American Compass or nonpartisan groups like the Coalition for a Prosperous America or the Alliance for American Manufacturing or Compact Magazine, I think there are good starts. And look, even J.R. Nyquist, he is a very erudite fellow. He's very bright. He has long understood that free trade has been a failure, especially on national security grounds. So as Trent Houghton, so they're definitely even with people on whose conservatism I don't fully gel well with, and it's not an insult to them. It's just a reality. Yeah. On certain key issues like free trade, there's a real understanding that it's deeply problematic and flawed. And they have had some personal experiences on the trade issue where, like J.R. Nyquist, for example, he lobbied on behalf of a business group in California against NAFTA. It's a whole long story. And he's mentioned this publicly, too. Or where he met the political counselor of a prominent Republican conservative billionaire that was a noted donor to conservative causes. I won't mention the name because I'm not sure if he mentioned it publicly, but he did tell me privately. Sure. And they told him that, look, we know that the Cold War never really ended, that Russia and China were continued to be a threat in the 1990s, but we really can't back your book, Origins of the Fourth World War, which was written and published in 1998 or 1999, because the financial and industrial elite they want to do business deals and invest in Russia and China. And all we have to do is to just push for missile defense and we'll get everything we want and the country will be protected. Well, that's what happened. And that was, of course, very disillusioning for him. So he is a critic of capitalism from certain standpoints, and a portion of his audience does not, likes a lot of my work, but when a comment was made on his website, on his blog, he writes a lot of very interesting essays, and somebody really laid into me, who actually since has apologized to me privately. But the guy got like about 5 likes for his post, basically saying that I basically propagate socialist sounding ideas, and there was some personal attacks there, and that person got about 5 likes. So, you know, a portion of his audience, they are not crazy about a lot of them, probably my domestic views, but a portion of his audience also likes me and respects me because I'm an anti-communist. And they, I mean, a lot of these people are very good Americans. I mean, you know, stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to insult them. But this is where I get into problems with my views, because I'm sure they think, wow, he says a lot of very good communist stuff, but, you know, here he's sounding way too centrist or left-wing for their taste. And I think that's also very confusing for people, because I sound, quote unquote, very hard right, pro-America, but then what is he doing? Supporting labor unions or regulations on the economy, or maybe Medicare for all, which combines private enterprise and medicine, but maybe calls into question the dysfunctional business model of private health insurance. So it's like, and that's very off-putting and confusing to people, because I think we're just so used to, this is what your belief is, you're a conservative, you have to believe this, and this is reinforced, as you said, by the media entertainment complex within Conservative Incorporated. And you know, it is very unfortunate because it precludes healthy discussions and really critical thinking and whatnot. Whereas, go ahead.
It takes advantage of, and I don't mean that it's even a necessarily on purpose advantage, but a lot of people come in to the fold, as it were, disillusioned. Either they're disillusioned by like any portion of the left or the Democrats, or they're really passionate about a single issue. So, you know, maybe open on a ton of other issues. But, and I kind of touched on this earlier about the problem I have with ideologies like, well, basically like modern conservatism, and the left has its own analogs to that. That, you know, you're taught like this whole story, you know, from Buckley through, you know, present day, what happened, why this policy's good, this policy's good. And like you said, it kind of precludes actual delving into history and thing. I thought it was a bad thing to like Teddy Roosevelt for a number of years as a conservative. I'd always like kind of wanted to like him, because who can't like that smile? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as a politically, I knew that he had been a progressive, and so had wanted a more centralized answers. And so that was actually one of my favorite things about the last, say, 6 years is studying up on him. And really, he helped. Trump kind of, I'll tell this to people, Trump kind of opened the door just because he was such a bull in a china shop. But then to study TR a little bit, and really just feel my own politics change just from his example was cool. And I think I don't know the answer to Conservative Inc., and I think it'll just be more good stuff from people like you and me. You know, it'll be just a slow trickle, and then usually people like Sohrab and Orencast, the kind of connected, fairly charismatic people who can not tear down the narrative per se, because there are good things in the narrative and critiques that modern conservatism made about mid-century America that were useful, but to open up that, okay, well, the goals that you're pushing for aren't being met by this story you're telling yourself. Because I like to write, so I like to the narrative is everything, and part of the problem that I think populists like Sorab, who by the way I love him dearly, and maybe someday I'll get to speak to him. But if I had a critique of him, it's that he's too impatient. Because it's funny because I'll see him just railing about something or other on Twitter from one day to the next. It's like, dude, okay, you've been in this for like 3-4 years, we've got a little while to go yet. And he has perfectly good reason and can do whatever he wants, but I just think that's my activist critique. But
yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, it's a very good point. There has to be a level of patience. Rome wasn't built in a day.
No, not at all. I actually should probably get off pretty quick.
Yeah, me too. It's already almost 12 o'clock again. And again, I'm not, when I mention certain audiences, like your Nyquist audience, it's a good people. It's just their portion of them, they love my work. But others, they don't. And this is where you have to it's not an insult. So I know a lot of people, there's a lot of crossover into the audience for this show. Mm-hmm. But this is where a little bit about my story, where I've gotten into trouble with a lot of varying strains of conservative and anti-communist thought. It's just kind of an exhibit A. And look, I mean, these are the points that I make. I appreciate your patience and everyone's patience when I kind of elaborate this. I hope I explain this well, and I think you've given a lot of very interesting opinions and insights. I really appreciate having you on the show, and I hope to have you back on the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on again. It was fun.
Alrighty, you take care. Have a great night. God bless, and stay safe.
You as well.